The freezing rain lashed against Gwendolyn Crawford's face as the wagon wheel struck a boulder, launching her small frame into the darkness of the Montana Territory wilderness. It was 1878, and what had begun as a journey west to start anew had devolved into a nightmare of mud, thunder, and abandonment. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs as she landed hard on the sodden earth. Through the curtain of rain, she glimpsed the wagon continuing onward, her traveling companions either unaware of her fall or unwilling to stop in such treacherous conditions. Their lantern light grew smaller until it vanished completely into the stormy night, leaving her utterly alone. Gwendolyn struggled to her feet, her soaked green traveling dress now caked with mud and torn at the hem. The 22-year-old schoolteacher had left Philadelphia with such hope, answering an advertisement for an educator position in Helena. Now, miles from any settlement, she shivered violently as the cold penetrated to her bones. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the howling wind. "Please wait." No answer came except the rumble of distant thunder. Clutching her arms around herself, she stumbled forward, searching desperately for shelter or any sign of civilization. Each step became more difficult as her boots sank into the mud, and the relentless rain continued to soak through her woolen coat. After what felt like hours but might have been only minutes, Gwendolyn's strength began to fail. Her shivers had become uncontrollable tremors, and her thoughts grew sluggish. She collapsed beneath a large pine tree, its branches offering minimal protection from the downpour. As consciousness began to slip away, she thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. "Just my imagination," she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed. The hoofbeats grew louder, and suddenly, a deep voice cut through the storm. "Madam? Can you hear me?" Gwendolyn forced her eyes open to see a tall figure dismounting from a horse. In the flash of lightning, she caught a glimpse of a rugged face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, water cascading from its edges. "I help," she managed to whisper before darkness claimed her. Declan Moore had been tracking a stray from his herd when the storm hit. At 30 years old, he'd seen enough Montana weather to know when to seek shelter, but something had kept him riding instinct perhaps, or just plain stubbornness. Either way, finding a woman half dead from exposure beneath a pine tree hadn't been part of his plans. He knelt beside her, noting her fine clothing despite the mud and water. She wasn't from around these parts, that much was certain. Declan placed 2 fingers against her neck, relieved to find a pulse, though it was weak and rapid. "Madam? Can you stand?" he asked, but received no response. Without hesitation, he removed his oilskin duster and wrapped it around her shivering form. Then, with gentle efficiency, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, this slip of a woman with auburn hair plastered to her pale face. "Hang on," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "I've got you now." Declan managed to mount his horse while cradling her against his chest. His cabin was less than 2 miles away, not far under normal circumstances, but in this storm, it would be a challenging ride. The woman's body was dangerously cold against his, and he knew hypothermia was a real threat. "Come on, Scout," he urged his horse. "Get us home." The loyal buckskin responded, picking his way carefully through the darkness while Declan hunched over the unconscious woman, trying to shield her from the worst of the rain. He felt her stir slightly, a good sign that she was still fighting. "That's it," he encouraged. "Stay with me." By the time Declan's cabin came into view, his arms ached from holding her, but he'd never been more relieved to see the sturdy log structure. He dismounted carefully, keeping her secure in his arms, and kicked at the door. "Jeb!" he called out to his ranch hand. "Open up!" The door swung open, revealing a weathered man in his 60s. Jeb Harrison's eyes widened at the sight of Declan carrying an unconscious woman. "Lord Almighty!" the older man exclaimed. "What you got there?" "Found her out in the storm," Declan explained, moving quickly to the fireplace where flames still burned. "She's half frozen. Need to warm her up." Jeb hurried to add more logs to the fire. "I'll put coffee on." "Grab those blankets too," Declan directed as he gently laid the woman on the bearskin rug before the hearth. In the firelight he got his first good look at her face's delicate features, long lashes, and lips that had taken on a worrying bluish tint. Declan knew what needed to be done, though it went against his sense of propriety. "Madam," he said loudly, hoping to rouse her, "your clothes are soaked through. We need to get you warm." When she didn't respond, he looked to Jeb, who had returned with an armful of blankets. "I don't see we have much choice," the older man said, understanding Declan's hesitation. "She'll die in those wet things." With a nod, Declan began the uncomfortable task of removing the woman's outer garments. He worked with clinical efficiency, keeping her undergarments in place for modesty's sake, and quickly wrapped her in the thick woolen blankets. "I'll tend to the horse," Jeb offered, recognizing that Declan would want to stay with the woman. Alone with his unexpected guest, Declan carefully tucked the blankets around her, noting with concern that her shivering had almost stopped, not a good sign. He knew from experience that when the body grew too cold to shiver, the danger was greatest. "Come on now," he murmured, rubbing her arms through the blankets. "Fight." He built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, then dampened a cloth with warm water and gently wiped the mud from her face. As he did, her eyelids fluttered. "That's it," he encouraged. "Wake up now." Gwendolyn's world came back to her in fragments: warmth, the crackling of a fire, the scent of coffee and pine, and a deep voice coaxing her back to consciousness. Her eyes opened slowly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings before focusing on the man kneeling beside her. He had the weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors, with striking blue eyes that studied her with evident concern. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and a day's growth of beard shadowed his strong jaw. "Where?" she managed, her voice a raspy whisper. "You're safe," he replied. "My cabin. I found you collapsed in the storm. I'm Declan Moore." Gwendolyn tried to sit up, becoming acutely aware that she was wrapped in blankets and wearing significantly fewer layers than before. Heat that had nothing to do with the fire rushed to her cheeks. "My clothing? Had to remove your outer things," Declan explained, having the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "They were soaked through. You were in danger of freezing to death." She wanted to be scandalized, but survival took precedence over propriety. "Thank you," she said instead. "I'm Gwendolyn Crawford." "Where were you headed, Miss Crawford? And how did you end up alone in that storm?" Gwendolyn's memories came rushing back: the wagon, the wheel striking the rock, the terrible moment of being thrown into the darkness. "I was traveling to Helena. I've accepted a position as a schoolteacher there." She paused, swallowing hard. "The wagon hit something. I was thrown out, and they didn't stop." Declan's expression darkened. "They left you? In that storm? Perhaps they didn't notice," she offered, though she didn't believe it herself. The truth was harder to admit: that the other travelers had likely considered her a burden not worth turning back for. Was all Declan said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're recovered. Helena's still a good 40 miles north." Before Gwendolyn could respond, the cabin door opened, and an older man entered, stomping his boots on the threshold. "Horse is settled," he announced before noticing that Gwendolyn was awake. He removed his hat. "Madam, good to see you with us again. Name's Jeb Harrison. Gwendolyn Crawford," she replied. "I'm in your debt, gentlemen." "Nonsense," Jeb said. "Just doing what any decent folk would do." He moved to the stove, where a coffee pot was steaming. "Coffee's ready, and I can fix up some stew if you're hungry." Gwendolyn realized she was indeed famished. "That would be wonderful, thank you." Declan helped her sit up, propping her against a chair while keeping the blankets securely around her. "Your dress should be dry by morning," he told her. "I hung it near the stove." She nodded gratefully, taking in her surroundings. The cabin was simple but comfortable: one main room with a fireplace, a stove, a table with chairs, and what appeared to be two separate sleeping areas divided by blankets hung from the ceiling. "This is your home?" she asked. "For 8 years now," Declan replied. "I run cattle on about 2,000 acres. Jeb here helps me manage it." "Just the two of you?" "Hire extra hands during calving and roundup," Jeb explained as he ladled stew into a bowl. "Rest of the time, we manage." Gwendolyn accepted the bowl with thanks, embarrassed by how her hands trembled as she took the first spoonful. The rich, hearty stew was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, or perhaps it was just that she'd come so close to never tasting anything again. "This is wonderful," she said sincerely. Jeb beamed. "Secrets in the spices. And not overcooking the venison." As she ate, Gwendolyn felt strength returning to her limbs. The terrible cold that had seemed to reach her very soul was gradually receding, replaced by the blessed warmth of the fire and the simple hospitality of these two strangers. "I don't know how to thank you both," she said when she'd finished the stew. "If you hadn't found me." "But he did," Jeb said matter-of-factly. "No sense dwelling on what might have been." Declan had been watching her quietly. "You should rest," he said. "You've been through an ordeal. You can take my bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he insisted, his tone gentle but firm. "Doctor's orders." "Are you a doctor?" she asked, surprised. A smile touched his lips for the first time. "No, madam, but I've doctored enough sick calves to know when someone needs rest." Despite herself, Gwendolyn laughed. "I'm not sure how I feel about being compared to a sick calf, Mr. Moore." "Declan," he corrected. "And I meant no offense." "None taken," she assured him. "And please call me Gwendolyn." Jeb cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be turning in. Miss Crawford, good to meet you, despite the circumstances. Declan, wake me if you need anything." After the older man had retired to his section of the cabin, Declan helped Gwendolyn to her feet, keeping the blankets around her. She was surprised by her own weakness, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Easy now," he murmured, his arms strong around her waist. He guided her to his sleeping area, a simple space with a wooden bed frame holding a straw-filled mattress covered with clean sheets, and several quilts. A trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and a small table held a lamp and a book. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetically. "It's perfect," she replied, meaning it. After thinking she might die alone in the rain, this humble bed seemed like luxury beyond measure. Declan helped her sit on the edge of the bed. "I'll be right outside this blanket if you need anything. Just call." Gwendolyn nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. "Thank you, Declan. For everything." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Rest well, Gwendolyn." After he'd gone, she carefully arranged herself in the bed, still wrapped in the blankets he'd provided. The sheets smelled of sunshine and pine, clean and somehow comforting. As she drifted toward sleep, Gwendolyn found herself thinking about the strange turn her journey had taken. She'd set out for a new beginning, and while this wasn't what she'd planned, something told her that being thrown from that wagon might not have been the disaster it had first seemed. Morning came with the gentle sounds of life stirring in the cabin. Gwendolyn opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through a small window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. For a moment, she was disoriented, until the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up carefully, relieved to find that most of her strength had returned. Her dress, she noticed, had been laid at the foot of the bed, along with her other garments, all dry and surprisingly clean considering their condition the night before. After dressing as best she could without assistance, though she had to leave a few hooks unfastened at the back, Gwendolyn gathered her courage and pulled aside the blanket that separated Declan's sleeping area from the main room. The cabin was empty, but a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, and a plate covered with a cloth waited on the table. She found a note propped against the cup. "Miss Crawford gone to check the herd. Help yourself to breakfast. Back by midday. DM." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. Gwendolyn poured herself coffee and discovered biscuits and bacon beneath the cloth cover. As she ate, she considered her situation. She was still 40 miles from Helena. With no transportation and few possessions, her trunk had been on the wagon that had continued without her. A clatter at the door announced Jeb's return. He entered carrying an armful of firewood, looking surprised to see her up and about. "Morning, Miss Crawford. Feeling better, I see." "Much better, thank you. Though I'm afraid I'm at something of a loss as to what to do next." Jeb set the wood beside the fireplace. "Declan's gone to town. Thought he might inquire about your wagon, see if it passed through." Hope flared in her chest. "Do you think there's a chance of recovering my belongings?" "If anyone can track them down, it's Declan," Jeb assured her. "Man's got a way of getting things done. I've imposed on your kindness enough already," Gwendolyn began, but Jeb waved away her concerns. "Nonsense. Been a while since we had a lady's company. Does us good." Gwendolyn smiled, genuinely touched by the old rancher's hospitality. "At least let me help with something. I'm not accustomed to idleness." Jeb scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, if you're feeling up to it, the garden could use some tending. Weeds growing faster than the vegetables these days." Eager to be useful, Gwendolyn followed Jeb outside, where she got her first proper look at Declan Moore's ranch. The cabin sat nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills, with a small barn and corral nearby. Beyond stretched meadows where cattle grazed in the distance. A modest garden plot stood to one side of the cabin, indeed somewhat overrun with weeds. "It's beautiful here," she commented, breathing in the clean mountain air. "Declan picked this spot careful-like," Jeb told her. "Water nearby, sheltered from the worst winter winds, good grazing for the cattle. Boy's got a good eye." "How long have you known him?" "Since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Worked for his pa back in Kansas. When James Moore passed on and Declan decided to head west, I came along. Someone had to keep an eye on him." Gwendolyn smiled at the obvious affection in the old man's voice. "You're like family." "Close as," Jeb agreed. "Tools are in the shed there. Don't overdo it now." As Jeb went about his chores, Gwendolyn set to work in the garden. The physical labor felt good after her ordeal, and there was something satisfying about clearing the weeds to reveal neat rows of vegetables. The sun warmed her back as she worked, and she found herself humming softly. By midday, she had made significant progress, though her hands unused to such labor had developed a few blisters. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until a shadow fell across the garden. Looking up, she found Declan watching her from atop his horse, an unreadable expression on his face. In daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with those striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore simple clothes, a blue cotton shirt, denim trousers, and well-worn boots, with a gun belt at his hip that spoke of the realities of frontier life. "You should be resting," he said by way of greeting, dismounting in one fluid motion. "I've rested enough," she replied, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. "Did you learn anything in town?" A shadow crossed his face. "Your wagon passed through Willow Creek late last night. The driver claimed you decided to stay behind in Bozeman." Anger flashed through her. "That's a lie. I fell from the wagon when the wheel struck something. They must have known I was missing." "I believe you," Declan said quietly. "No one chooses to be left alone in a storm. My things already on their way to Helena," he informed her. "But I sent a telegram to the sheriff there. With luck, your trunk will be waiting when you arrive." Gwendolyn sank onto a nearby stump, the full impact of her situation hitting her anew. "I don't even have a way to get to Helena now. Stage comes through in 3 days," Declan told her. "You're welcome to stay until then." She looked up at him, this man who had already done so much for her. "I can't impose further." "It's no imposition," he said simply. Then, noticing her hands, he frowned. "You're hurt." Before she could protest, he'd taken her hands in his, turning them over to examine the blisters. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, calloused hands. "These need tending," he said. "Come inside." Too surprised to argue, Gwendolyn followed him into the cabin, where he directed her to sit at the table while he retrieved a small tin of salve. "This will help," he explained, dipping his fingers into the salve. "May sting a bit." It did sting when he applied it to her blisters, but Gwendolyn was more distracted by the careful way he held her hands, as if they were something precious. No man had ever treated her with such consideration before. "You weren't raised to ranch work," he observed. "No. I grew up in Philadelphia. My father was a banker." "What brings a Philadelphia banker's daughter to Montana Territory as a schoolteacher?" There was no judgment in his question, only curiosity. Still, Gwendolyn hesitated. Her reasons for leaving home were personal, painful. "A fresh start," she said simply, hoping he wouldn't press further. Something in Declan's eyes suggested he understood more than she'd said. "Montana's good for that," was all he replied. When he'd finished with the salve, he reluctantly released her hands. "Rest them today. Garden can wait." "Yes, doctor," she teased, earning a hint of a smile. "Jeb tells me you're quite the gardener," Declan said, changing the subject. "Says you accomplished more this morning than he has all spring." Gwendolyn laughed. "I doubt that's true. But I did enjoy it, feeling useful, I mean. You're not accustomed to being idle." "No. Even in Philadelphia, I kept busy with teaching and charity work." She hesitated, then added, "After my father died, I had to support myself. Idleness wasn't an option." "I'm sorry about your father," Declan said sincerely. "Thank you. It's been 3 years now." "And your mother?" "Passed when I was young. Just a vague memory now." Gwendolyn found herself sharing more than she'd intended, but something about Declan's straightforward manner made it easy to talk to him. "What about your family?" "Lost Pa to fever 6 years back. Ma died when I was 12. No siblings." Simple statements of fact, yet Gwendolyn sensed the depth of loss behind them. "And so you came west?" "Pa always talked about it. After he was gone, nothing holding me in Kansas." He shrugged. "Jeb came along. Said I'd get myself killed without him. He cares for you a great deal." Feelings mutual. Declan stood, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. "You must be hungry. I'll see about lunch." As he moved to the stove, Gwendolyn watched him, intrigued by this man of few words who communicated so much through actions rather than speech. He had saved her life, offered her shelter, and was now preparing food for her all without expectation of anything in return. Such men were rare in her experience. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm that became surprisingly comfortable. Despite Declan's initial insistence that she rest, Gwendolyn found ways to contribute, mending clothes that had been piling up, helping prepare meals, and yes, continuing to work in the garden when her hands healed enough. Declan seemed to accept that keeping busy was important to her dignity, and he gradually stopped protesting her efforts. In the evenings, they gathered around the fireplace, where Jeb often entertained them with stories of his long and colorful life. Gwendolyn, in turn, read aloud from Declan's small collection of books, her clear voice bringing the words to life in a way that had both men listening intently. During these quiet times, she often caught Declan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't merely the appreciation a man might have for a pretty woman, though there was some of that, but something deeper, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. On the second evening, after Jeb had retired, Declan finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Why Helena?" "There must be schools needing teachers closer to Philadelphia." Gwendolyn set aside the book she'd been reading. "There are," she acknowledged. "But I needed distance." "From what?" When she hesitated, he added, "You don't have to tell me." "No, it's all right." She took a deep breath. "After my father died, I became engaged to a man named William Barrett. He was a colleague of my father's, considerably older but well respected. It seemed a sensible match at the time. Declan said nothing, just waited for her to continue. As the wedding approached, I began to see a different side of him. Controlling, possessive. When I tried to break the engagement, She swallowed hard. He threatened to ruin my reputation, ensure I'd never teach again in Philadelphia. Declan's expression darkened. Did he hurt you? Not physically. But his threats were very real. He had influence. Gwendolyn stared into the fire. So I applied for positions as far away as possible. When the offer came from Helena, I accepted immediately. Does he know where you've gone? I didn't tell anyone specific details, but Helena isn't exactly hidden. If he truly wanted to find me, he won't trouble you here, Declan said with quiet certainty. Gwendolyn looked at him, surprised by the protective note in his voice. Thank you. But it's not your burden to bear. Some burdens are lighter when shared, he replied simply. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Declan cleared his throat and stood. It's late. You should rest before your journey tomorrow. Yes, of course. Gwendolyn rose as well, suddenly reluctant to see the evening end. Declan, I want to thank you again. No need, he interrupted. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. Not anyone. What you did, what you're still doing, it's extraordinary kindness. Declan looked uncomfortable with her praise. Get some rest, Gwendolyn, he said softly before retreating to his makeshift bed by the fire. As she lay in his bed that night, Gwendolyn found herself wishing that the stage wouldn't come the next day, that she could remain in this peaceful interlude a little longer. The thought startled her. She had a position waiting in Helena, responsibilities to fulfill. Yet in just 3 days, this cabin and its inhabitants had begun to feel more like home than Philadelphia ever had. Morning brought a somber mood to the cabin. Jeb was uncharacteristically quiet as he prepared breakfast, and Declan had gone out at dawn, saying he needed to check the eastern fence line before taking Gwendolyn to meet the stage. He'll be back in time, Jeb assured her when she glanced anxiously out the window. Declan's never late. I know, she said, though in truth, she'd been wondering if he might avoid saying goodbye altogether. Men like Declan, she was learning, often found actions easier than words. Her few belongings were packed in a small bundle that Declan had provided: a clean shirt for her to use as a nightgown, a spare hairbrush, and some dried food for the journey. Her dress, though still showing signs of her ordeal, was at least clean and serviceable again. When hoofbeats approached around mid-morning, Gwendolyn's heart quickened. She stepped outside to find Declan dismounting, his expression unreadable as ever. Stage will be coming through in about an hour, he informed her. We should head to the crossroads. I'm ready, she replied, though it wasn't entirely true. Jeb emerged from the cabin, carrying her small bundle. Made you some extra biscuits for the road, he told her, handing over the package. Stage food ain't worth eating half the time. Thank you, Jeb. For everything. Impulsively, Gwendolyn hugged the old rancher, who seemed startled but pleased by the gesture. You take care now, he said gruffly. And don't be a stranger if you're ever back this way. Declan had saddled a gentle mare for Gwendolyn, and he helped her mount with strong, steady hands at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, one that had nothing to do with the morning sun. They rode mostly in silence, Gwendolyn trying to memorize the landscape, the way the pine trees gave way to open meadows, the distant mountains still capped with snow even in late spring, the clear blue sky that seemed to go on forever. Montana was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that stirred something deep within her. You'll like Helena, Declan said eventually, breaking the silence. It's growing fast. Has most of the comforts you're used to. I'm discovering I need fewer comforts than I thought, she replied honestly. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. City life isn't for everyone. No, she agreed. Though I'm not sure I'm cut out for ranch life either. Those blisters prove that. Blisters toughen into calluses, he said. Given time. There was something in his tone that made her wonder if they were still talking about gardening. Before she could pursue the thought, the crossroads came into view, a simple junction where the ranch trail met the main road to Helena. Declan dismounted and helped Gwendolyn down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. They stood awkwardly, either quite meeting the other's eyes. "I've asked around about this William Barrett," Declan said suddenly. "If he shows up in Helena looking for you, people will be watching." Surprised and touched, Gwendolyn looked up at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Wanted to," he replied simply. In the distance, the sound of the approaching stagecoach became audible. Their time was running out. "Declan, I don't know how to thank you properly," Gwendolyn began. "No need for thanks." "Yes, there is," she insisted. "You saved my life. You opened your home to me. You've shown me kindness when you had no obligation to do so." He shifted uncomfortably. "Wasn't anything special. It was to me," she said softly. The stagecoach was visible now, a cloud of dust rising behind it as it approached the crossroads. Declan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small folded paper. "My direction," he explained, handing it to her. "If you ever need anything, or if Barrett causes trouble." Gwendolyn took the paper, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you." The stagecoach pulled to a stop, the driver calling out, "Crossroads! 5 minutes only!" Declan picked up her bundle and handed it to the driver, then turned back to Gwendolyn. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, might give voice to the unspoken current that had been building between them. Instead, he simply helped her into the coach with that same gentle strength he'd shown from the beginning. "Safe journey," he said, stepping back. "Goodbye, Declan," she replied, holding his gaze until the driver called out and the coach lurched forward. As the stagecoach pulled away, Gwendolyn looked back through the small window to see Declan still standing at the crossroads, watching her leave. Only when he was a distant figure did she unfold the paper he'd given her, finding not just his address but a brief note. "The door is always open. DM." Simple words, yet they carried a weight of meaning that brought tears to her eyes. She carefully tucked the note into her bodice, close to her heart, and turned her attention to the road ahead. Helena was everything and nothing like Gwendolyn had expected. The territorial capital bustled with activity, miners, merchants, families, and government officials all going about their business in the shadow of the mountains. Buildings of varying quality lined the main street, from simple wooden structures to more substantial brick edifices that spoke to the town's growing prosperity. The school board chairman, Mr. Peterson, met her stagecoach, apologizing profusely for the trouble with her previous transportation. "Disgraceful behavior," he declared when she explained what had happened. "Rest assured, Miss Crawford, we'll see about recovering your belongings. In the meantime, we've arranged temporary lodgings with Mrs. Hollister, a widow who takes in boarders. Very respectable establishment." Gwendolyn thanked him, though she found herself comparing the busy streets of Helena unfavorably to the peaceful ranch she'd left behind. Still, she reminded herself, this was why she'd come west to start anew, to build a life of her own making. Mrs. Hollister proved to be a kind, if somewhat overwhelming, woman in her 50s who immediately took Gwendolyn under her wing. "You poor dear," she clucked, showing Gwendolyn to a small but clean room on the second floor of her boarding house. "Thrown from a wagon and rescued by a cowboy! It's like something from a dime novel." Gwendolyn smiled politely, unwilling to share the details of her time with Declan. Those memories felt private, precious. "The sheriff recovered your trunk," Mrs. Hollister continued. "It's being delivered tomorrow. In the meantime, I'm sure we can find you something suitable to wear. Can't have Helena's new schoolteacher looking like she's been dragged through the wilderness." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Gwendolyn settled into her new position. The school was a simple one-room building with 28 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. The work was challenging but rewarding, and Gwendolyn found herself genuinely enjoying the children's enthusiasm. Her trunk had indeed been recovered, though some items were mysteriously missing, her mother's locket among them, which grieved her deeply. Still, she had her clothes and books, enough to establish herself properly in Helena. She took meals with Mrs. Hollister, and the other boarders, a young bank clerk, an elderly retired judge, and a middle-aged seamstress. The conversation was pleasant enough, but Gwendolyn often found herself thinking of the quiet evenings by Declan's fireplace, where words had seemed to carry more weight. Several times she began letters to Declan, wanting to let him know she'd arrived safely, that she was thinking of him. Each attempt ended up in the fire, as she couldn't find the right words. What could she say that wouldn't sound trivial or, worse, presumptuous? He had saved her life and shown her kindness. That didn't mean he wanted an ongoing correspondence. As spring turned to summer, Helena grew even busier. The 4th of July celebration brought people from all the surrounding areas into town for a day of speeches, games, and dancing. Gwendolyn, as the schoolteacher, was expected to attend and found herself the object of attention from several eligible bachelors. Timothy Hargrove, the town's young doctor, was particularly attentive, bringing her lemonade and asking her to save him a dance. He was handsome, well-spoken, and clearly interested. By all accounts, he should have been exactly the kind of suitor Gwendolyn would welcome. Yet as they danced, she found herself comparing his practiced charm to Declan's straightforward honesty, his smooth hands to Declan's calloused ones. When Timothy asked if he might call on her, she gave a non-committal answer that clearly disappointed him. "Is there someone else, Miss Crawford?" he asked perceptively. "No," she replied, too quickly. "That is, I'm simply focused on establishing myself as a teacher right now." Timothy nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Of course. Perhaps in time, then." As July turned to August, Gwendolyn found herself thinking of Declan Moore, not less. She wondered how the ranch was faring, whether the garden was still producing, if Jeb was still telling his outlandish stories by the fire. Most of all, she wondered if Declan ever thought of her. The answer came unexpectedly one hot August afternoon as school was letting out. Gwendolyn was gathering her materials when a shadow fell across her desk. Looking up, she froze at the sight of Declan Moore standing in the doorway of her schoolhouse, hat in hand. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining him a figment conjured by her persistent thoughts. But no, he was real, solid, and somehow even more handsome than she remembered in his clean shirt and brushed hat. "Declan," she breathed, hardly trusting her voice. "Miss Crawford," he replied formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied his tone. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she assured him, heart racing. "What brings you to Helena?" "Business, mostly. Selling some cattle." He paused. "And I wanted to see that you were settling in all right." The simple admission sent a flutter through her chest. "That's very kind of you." "Not kindness," he said quietly. Before she could ask what he meant, the last of her students called goodbye as they left, leaving them alone in the schoolhouse. "You look well," Declan observed, taking a step closer. "As do you," she replied, suddenly conscious of how formal they were being, when her memories of their time together were anything but. "Your school seems nice." "It is. The children are wonderful." Gwendolyn hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "How is Jeb?" A smile touched Declan's lips. "Ornery as ever. Sends his regards. Says the garden hasn't been the same since you left." "I miss it," she admitted. "The ranch, I mean. It was peaceful." "It misses you too," Declan said, then quickly added. "That is, Jeb says the place is too quiet now." Gwendolyn felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "How long are you in Helena?" "Leaving tomorrow. Unless..." He trailed off, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Unless?" she prompted. Declan took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Unless I had reason to stay longer." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Gwendolyn's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Would you like to walk with me?" she asked impulsively. "I could show you Helena." Relief and something warmer flooded his expression. I'd like that very much. They walked through the streets of Helena, Gwendolyn pointing out buildings of interest while stealing glances at the man beside her. In the late afternoon sun, with his hat shadowing his face, he looked both familiar and new, the Declan she remembered, yet somehow more. Are you truly happy here? He asked suddenly as they paused by a small park. The directness of the question caught her off guard. Yes, I suppose I am. The work is fulfilling, and the people have been kind. But? He prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. Gwendolyn looked up at him, deciding on honesty. But sometimes I find myself thinking of your cabin, and the mountains, and even those wretched blisters from gardening. A smile tugged at his lips. Gardens producing well now. Jeb's had to give away vegetables to half the county. I'm glad to hear it. They continued walking, eventually finding themselves at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open country. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Beautiful, Gwendolyn murmured. Yes, Declan agreed, though when she glanced at him, he was looking at her, not the sunset. Gathering her courage, Gwendolyn asked, Why did you really come to Helena, Declan? He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer. Finally, he said, I told myself it was to check on you. Make sure you were safe, settled. And was it? Partly. He turned to face her fully. But the truth is, Gwendolyn, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you left. The cabin feels empty. Even Jeb noticed I've been poor company. Her breath caught. I've thought of you too, she admitted softly. Often. Declan took a step closer. I'm not good with words. Never have been. But those 3 days when you were at the ranch, they changed something in me. In me as well, Gwendolyn whispered. I don't have much to offer, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. The ranch is small compared to some, and the life is hard. Nothing like Philadelphia. Philadelphia was never home to me the way your ranch felt, even in those few days, she told him honestly. Hope flared in his eyes. What are you saying, Gwendolyn? I'm saying that perhaps the storm that threw me from that wagon wasn't a misfortune after all, she replied, her heart in her throat. Perhaps it was leading me where I needed to be. Declan reached out slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with cold. I came to ask if you might consider coming back, he said quietly. Not just for a visit. The school in Willow Creek needs a teacher too. It's closer to the ranch. Are you proposing a job offer, Mr. Moore? She asked, a smile playing at her lips. No, he replied seriously. I'm proposing a life. Together. If you want it. The directness of his words took her breath away. There was no flowery language, no practiced charm, just Declan, offering his heart with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. I hardly know you, she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. In those 3 days she had seen the essence of the man before her, his kindness, his integrity, his strength. We have time, he assured her. All the time you need. I'm not asking for an answer today. Just consider it. Gwendolyn looked into his eyes, so blue and earnest, and found herself making a decision that would have seemed reckless just months ago, but now felt inevitable. I don't need time, she said. I've had enough of cities and propriety, and doing what's expected. I want a life that feels real, Declan. With someone who sees me for who I am, not what I represent. And who are you, Gwendolyn Crawford? He asked softly. She smiled, feeling a certainty she'd never experienced before. I'm a woman who fell from a wagon in the rain and found something unexpected, a place where I belong. Declan's face transformed with a smile that made her heart skip. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with promise. When they parted, Gwendolyn knew with absolute certainty that her life had changed course once again, this time by choice rather than circumstance. There would be challenges ahead, adjustments to make, but standing there in the fading light with Declan's hand in hers, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt home. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of decisions and arrangements. Gwendolyn gave notice to the Helena School Board, who were disappointed but understanding when she explained her situation. Mrs. Hollister, far from being scandalized by Gwendolyn's plans, was thoroughly delighted by the romance of it all. "A cowboy who rescued you in a storm and then came back for you! It's the most romantic thing I've ever heard," she declared, helping Gwendolyn pack her trunk. "Though I do insist on a proper wedding before you move to that ranch, young lady." Gwendolyn had blushed but agreed. Though she and Declan had fallen in love quickly, they were both committed to doing things properly. He had ridden back to the ranch to prepare while Gwendolyn completed the school term, with plans to return in a month for their wedding. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held in Helena's small church with Mrs. Hollister, Jeb, and a few of Gwendolyn's students in attendance. Gwendolyn wore a new dress of pale blue, Declan's favorite color. She'd learned and carried wildflowers gathered that morning. When Declan saw her walking toward him down the aisle, the look of wonder on his face was worth every moment of uncertainty she'd ever felt. He stood tall and proud in a new black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his usual hat absent to reveal dark hair neatly combed for the occasion. "You're beautiful," he whispered when she reached him. "So are you," she replied with a smile, loving the way his ears reddened at the compliment. The minister's words washed over them as they made their vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When Declan slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one that had belonged to his mother, he told her Gwendolyn felt tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Declan's kiss was gentle yet possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. When they turned to face their small gathering of well-wishers, Gwendolyn saw Jeb hastily wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The journey back to the ranch was filled with anticipation. Gwendolyn had secured the teaching position at the Willow Creek School, which would allow her to continue her profession while living with Declan. The school was small, just 12 students, but the community had been thrilled to attract an experienced teacher from back east. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Gwendolyn felt a surge of emotion. The cabin looked just as she remembered, though she noticed new curtains in the windows and fresh paint on the door. "Did you do that for me?" she asked, gesturing to these improvements. Declan nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Wanted it to feel welcoming." "It always did," she assured him, squeezing his hand. Jeb, who had ridden ahead to prepare things, was waiting on the porch with a broad smile. As Declan helped Gwendolyn down from the wagon, the old rancher approached with a bouquet of wildflowers. "Welcome home, Mrs. Moore," he said, presenting the flowers with a flourish. "Thank you, Jeb," she replied, deeply touched by the gesture. "It's good to be home." Declan carried her over the threshold, a tradition he had insisted on despite her laughing protests that it wasn't necessary. Inside, Gwendolyn found the cabin transformed. The space had been thoroughly cleaned, the furniture rearranged to create a more comfortable living area, and the sleeping quarters now properly divided with real walls instead of hanging blankets. "Declan, when did you do all this?" she asked in amazement. "Been working on it since I came back from Helena," he admitted. "Wanted it to be right for you." "It's perfect," she assured him, taking in the polished wooden floors, the new shelves filled with her books alongside his, and the comfortable-looking bed visible through the open door to their bedroom. Jeb cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be staying in the bunkhouse from now on. Give you two some privacy." He winked at Gwendolyn. "Don't worry, I'll still come by for meals. Can't have Declan's cooking killing you in your first week of marriage." After Jeb had gone, Declan took Gwendolyn in his arms. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. "It's not Philadelphia. Life here is harder, simpler. I've never been more certain of anything, she replied, reaching up to touch his face. This is where I belong, Declan. With you. His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a passion that took her breath away. As the sun set outside, casting the cabin in golden light, Gwendolyn knew that the journey that had begun with her being thrown from a wagon in the rain had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The seasons passed, each bringing new joys and challenges to the Moore Ranch. Gwendolyn thrived as the teacher in Willow Creek, riding to and from the small schoolhouse each day on a gentle mare Declan had trained especially for her. The students adored their new teacher, who brought an enthusiasm and creativity to their lessons that many had never experienced before. At home, Gwendolyn and Declan settled into a rhythm of shared work and companionship. She learned the routines of ranch life, how to preserve vegetables for winter, make soap from tallow, and even assist with calving when extra hands were needed. Her city-bred hands toughened, just as Declan had predicted, though he still insisted on rubbing salve into them on winter evenings when the cold made them crack. Declan, for his part, discovered a love of reading that had been dormant since childhood. Each evening after chores, Gwendolyn would read aloud from one of her books, and gradually, he began to read on his own as well. Sometimes she would come home from school to find him with a book in hand, so absorbed that he didn't hear her enter. "You've changed him," Jeb told her one day as they worked together in the garden that had first connected them. "Never seen him so settled, so at peace." "He's changed me too," Gwendolyn replied honestly. "I never knew I could be this happy with so little." Jeb snorted. "Little? You've got land, cattle, a roof over your head, and people who love you. Seems like plenty to me." He was right, of course. What had once seemed like a simple life now felt abundantly rich. The fancy dresses and social events of Philadelphia had been replaced by practical clothes and community gatherings, yet Gwendolyn never felt she had sacrificed anything of real value. Their first Christmas together brought a special joy. Declan surprised Gwendolyn with a small piano he'd purchased in Helena and somehow transported to the ranch without her knowledge. It sat proudly in the corner of their expanded cabin, a connection to her past life that touched her deeply. "How did you know?" she asked, running her fingers reverently over the keys. "You mentioned once that you missed playing," he explained. "Thought it might make the place feel more like home." "It already was home," she assured him, pulling him down for a kiss. "But this makes it even more so." That night, as snow fell gently outside, Gwendolyn played Christmas carols while Declan and Jeb sang along in their rough but enthusiastic voices. The cabin filled with music and laughter, and Gwendolyn thought her heart might burst with happiness. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, Gwendolyn confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting their first child. When she told Declan, his usual composure abandoned him entirely. He lifted her off her feet in a gentle embrace, his face alight with joy and wonder. "A baby," he whispered, setting her down carefully, as if she had suddenly become fragile. "Our baby. Due in late October, I believe," she told him, laughing at his protective hovering. "And I'm perfectly capable of continuing my normal activities for several months yet." Declan, however, was determined to ensure Gwendolyn's comfort and safety. He insisted on hiring a local girl to help with household chores, reduced Gwendolyn's teaching schedule as her pregnancy progressed, and even began constructing an addition to the cabin for the nursery. Jeb was nearly as excited as Declan, immediately appointing himself honorary grandfather and carving a beautiful wooden cradle that he presented with uncharacteristic shyness. "Been working on it since you told us," he explained. "Figured every baby needs a proper place to sleep." As summer turned to fall, Gwendolyn's body changed to accommodate the new life growing within her. Declan was fascinated by every development, placing his hand on her growing belly to feel the baby's movements, and reading every medical book he could find about childbirth and infant care. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Gwendolyn told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You already love this child so much. Never thought I'd have a family." he admitted. After my parents died, figured I'd live out my days alone, or with just Jeb for company. And now? He placed his hand over hers, where it rested on her rounded stomach. Now I can't imagine any other life. When Gwendolyn's time came in late October, it was during the first snowfall of the season, a gentle, silent blanket of white that covered the land. Declan had insisted on having the doctor from Willow Creek stay at the ranch for the final week, an expense Gwendolyn had protested but secretly appreciated. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Declan refusing to leave her side despite the doctor's initial suggestions that he wait outside. His steady presence, his hand holding hers through each contraction, gave Gwendolyn strength when her own began to flag. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her as she worked to bring their child into the world. "You can do this, Gwendolyn. I'm right here." As dawn broke on a crystal-clear morning, their daughter made her entrance with a lusty cry that brought tears to both parents' eyes. The doctor placed the red-faced, squalling infant on Gwendolyn's chest, where she immediately quieted, blinking up at her mother with unfocused eyes. "She's perfect," Gwendolyn whispered, overwhelmed by a love so intense it took her breath away. Declan, usually so composed, wept openly as he touched his daughter's tiny hand with one finger. "Hello, little one," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." They named her Catherine Joy Moore, Catherine after Gwendolyn's mother, and Joy for the feelings she had brought into their lives. Jeb, waiting anxiously outside the room, was the first visitor allowed in to meet the newest member of their family. "Well, don't she look just like her mama?" the old rancher declared, though the baby's dark hair and blue eyes clearly favored Declan. "Going to be a beauty, this one." Life with a newborn brought new challenges and adjustments. Nights were broken by Catherine's hungry cries, days were filled with the constant care a baby required, and Gwendolyn temporarily set aside her teaching duties to focus on motherhood. Yet through it all, the love between her and Declan only deepened, strengthened by the shared joy and responsibility of parenthood. As Catherine grew from infant to toddler, the ranch grew as well. Declan's careful management and hard work had paid off, allowing them to acquire additional grazing land and expand their herd. The cabin had been enlarged again, now a comfortable home that retained its rustic charm while providing ample space for their family. On Catherine's second birthday, as they celebrated with a small gathering of neighbors and friends from Willow Creek, Gwendolyn found herself watching Declan as he played with their daughter. His face, normally so reserved around others, was animated with laughter as Catherine squealed in delight at being swung in gentle circles. Later, after the guests had gone and Catherine was tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed horse, Gwendolyn and Declan sat by the fire in comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked suddenly. "When I was thrown from the wagon?" Declan nodded. "More often than you might expect. It seemed like such a disaster at the time," she mused. "I was cold, scared, certain I would die there in the rain. I still get angry thinking about those people leaving you behind," Declan admitted. "Never did find out who they were." "I'm glad," Gwendolyn said, surprising him. "Because if they hadn't left me, if you hadn't found me, we wouldn't be here now. Catherine wouldn't exist." Declan considered this, then nodded slowly. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best ones, I suppose." "Exactly." She moved to sit beside him, leaning against his solid warmth. "That storm brought me to you, Declan. And every day, I'm grateful for it." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "As am I, Gwendolyn. As am I." Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines, and stars scattered across the vast sky like diamonds on velvet. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a golden glow over the home that had been built not just with wood and nails, but with love, courage, and the belief that sometimes, being thrown from your path can lead you exactly where you're meant to be. As years passed, the Moore ranch flourished, as did the family that called it home. Catherine grew into a spirited girl with her father's quiet determination and her mother's love of learning. When she was 4, she welcomed a baby brother, James Declan Moore, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm that reminded Gwendolyn poignantly of the night that had changed her life. "A fitting welcome for a Moore," Declan had commented as thunder rolled overhead, and their son made his first cries. "Coming into the world with the rain, just like our family began." By the time Catherine was 10 and James 6, the ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the county. Declan's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread throughout the territory, bringing both financial security and respect. Gwendolyn had returned to teaching when James was old enough for school, bringing both children with her to the Willow Creek schoolhouse where they thrived under their mother's guidance and the companionship of other children. Jeb, now in his 70s but still spry, had officially retired from ranch work but remained an integral part of their family. He occupied a comfortable cabin Declan had built nearby, though he took most meals with the Moores and spent his days teaching James and Catherine the skills and stories he'd accumulated over his long life. On the 10th anniversary of the night Declan had found Gwendolyn in the storm, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. 10 years, Gwendolyn mused, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it seems like I've always been here with you." Declan's arm tightened around her waist. At 40, he was still as strong and capable as the day they'd met, though silver now threaded through the dark hair at his temples. "Best 10 years of my life," he said simply. "Even with all the challenges?" she teased, thinking of drought seasons, difficult births among the cattle, and the year James had developed pneumonia, frightening them all with his labored breathing and burning fever. "Especially with the challenges," Declan replied seriously. "They showed me what we can weather together." Inside, they could hear Catherine playing the piano. She had inherited her mother's musical talent, while James and Jeb engaged in what sounded like an intense chess match, judging by their occasional exclamations. "We've built something wonderful here," Gwendolyn said softly. "More than I ever dreamed possible when I left Philadelphia." "We're not finished building yet," Declan told her with a smile. "Got plenty more years ahead." As if to emphasize his point, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a steady pace. As he drew closer, Gwendolyn recognized Thomas Wilson, their nearest neighbor's son. "Evening, Mr. and Mrs. Moore," Thomas called as he reached the yard. At 17, he was a responsible young man who often helped during busy seasons. "Pa sent me to let you know the McClintocks are having a barn raising next Saturday. They're hoping you'll come." "We'll be there," Declan assured him. "Tell your father we'll bring pies and extra hands." After Thomas had gone with promises of pie, Gwendolyn smiled up at her husband. "You're right, you know. We're still building not just our ranch, but this community. Wouldn't have it any other way," Declan replied, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness he'd shown on the day they wed. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Gwendolyn found herself thinking of the extraordinary path that had led her to this life. From Philadelphia society to a Montana schoolhouse, from a terrifying night in the rain to the warmth and security of Declan's love, every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary. As she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, Gwendolyn whispered a prayer of gratitude for stormy nights, for brave cowboys, and for the beautiful unpredictability of life that had given her everything she hadn't known she needed. Declan pulled her closer in his sleep, as if even in dreams he was determined to keep her safe. Gwendolyn smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the most frightening falls lead to the most beautiful landings. And in the Montana night, as stars wheeled overhead and distant thunder rumbled in the mountains, the story that had begun with a woman thrown from a wagon in the rain continued to unfold, a story of love, family, and the courage to embrace the unexpected paths that lead us home.